All right, thank you, Profe. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was empty and void, and darkness covered the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Genesis 1 through 2. Now, this verse sets up something that should amaze us. I know you've probably heard it 100 times, but for a moment, let's focus on the first part of the verse. In the beginning, God created. He created, spoke into being. The Hebrew word for this is bara, and it means to form or shape, to fashion. And it's the first thing that we see God doing in the Bible. Later on, God brings humans into the picture. In Genesis 1:27, it says, God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. We're created in the image of God, and that means that when we create, we're actually reflecting God, that we were made to create. It's part of who we are, and it doesn't rely on whether or not we see ourselves as creative. Creativity has shaped who I am today. Since I was really young, I've loved making things. I can remember back when I was 8 or 9, and my parents came home one day with 2 giant Lego bins. My brothers and I were hooked. We would just spend hundreds of hours playing at the Lego bins, building whatever we could think of, then usually fighting each other with it. But as I've grown older, my love for creativity has been maintained, but it's been expressed in different ways. For example, when the Mandalorian Star Wars show came out, I was like, wow, this is really cool. And I wanted to make a Mandalorian costume. So I wanted one that looked like the movie, not like some Walmart prop. And I did some research, found out that like a costuming or crafting foam is what you tend to make them out of. My parents had some foam workout mats, and I was like, that looks like it'll work. So I bartered the mats off of them, and I started making the costume with that. And for the helmet, actually, it took me 12 tries before I got a helmet I liked. And that was about 75 hours of just making helmets. And it didn't feel like work because creating things is something that I love doing. Thing is, though, making things can take a lot of time. More recently, some of my friends got really into longboarding, and one of them let me ride his longboard around. I was like, this is a lot of fun, so I went and I bought a cheap longboard. And I rode it until I remembered a book that I had seen at the library on how to create a custom longboard. So I checked that out, and I found a couple of videos online on the topic, and that was around the time that Capstone was starting. So I thought for a minute, and I realized if I pick creativity for my capstone topic, I'd get to make the longboard, but for school. And, that's pretty ideal. It also worked out perfectly because I had a class in the Genesis Center over there, and I was able to use the woodworking equipment. So it was a long process, but in the end, I came out with this longboard down here, and it's way better than the first one that I made. I enjoy starting projects and seeing them to completion. It's a way that I unwind and relax. And because of that, and the fact I'd get to make a longboard for school, I decided to pursue creativity for my capstone topic. This looked like interviewing 3 people, reading a book on creativity, and doing multiple projects, including the longboard, which was probably the biggest project that I did this year. I wanted to see, through all of it, how God and Scripture relate to creativity and how this would apply to us as people. Now, this all brings me to my first point, which is that creativity takes time, intentionality, and dedication. So as I said, I interviewed several people this year. One, Thomas, who is a songwriter and a music teacher. Another one is named Mr. Vaughn, and he's a songwriter, song producer, and a missionary. and then a YouTuber who creates mini models. He wanted to remain anonymous, so let's call him Boylai. So Thomas, the songwriter, he gave an analogy about the creative process that really stuck with me. He compared writing a song to shooting a basketball. Have you ever shot a basketball? When you're learning to shoot a basketball, you don't just get in the proper form for 20 minutes and stand there and look at the rim. No, you take the ball and you shoot it. And then you shoot it again and again. And you shoot the basketball until you can consistently make a basket. And that takes time and practice of actually shooting the ball. The first couple shots, maybe even 50 to 100, could be awful. It could take days, but eventually when you start making baskets, it's really rewarding. Creativity grows like a muscle. A lot of repetitions over a long period of time. Thomas explained this in songwriting terms. He said that everyone writes bad songs, but it's not that important. Instead, he works a week on one song. He said, I'm going to shoot the ball. If I miss, I'll just write another song. Those repetitions really help build the songwriting muscle. End quote. So I was reflecting on this, and I realized that creativity isn't like a lightning bolt or a light bulb turning on. You'll have those eureka moments, but a lot of people think that's what creativity is. It's not. Creativity, like shooting a basketball or learning an instrument, requires time and effort put into it so you can improve. Personally, I try and do something creative every day. That could look like playing the piano, or finding something to make, or starting a project. And it's something that I really enjoy, so it doesn't feel like work. Sometimes, though, things don't work out, and they take a lot more time than anticipated. For example, when I was making the longboard, I started by getting some plywood and gluing it together, putting it in this clamping system I made, so it would make the board easier to stand on. So I waited 2 days, and the glue had dried, so I took it out of the clamps and put it down. I got up on the longboard, and it cracked right down the middle. I was really disappointed, but I didn't give up. I got thinner sheets of plywood, and so I could layer more of them to try and make the board stronger. I repeated the same process, and then I stood on the board, and it worked. It didn't crack. It took twice the time, but eventually, by sticking through it, I came out with a good longboard. Now, creativity takes time, intentionality, and effort. And when you're putting so much time and effort into something, you begin to wonder, what's the point of it? What's the end goal, not of the projects individually, but of even doing them in the first place? Why even be creative? And that is my second lesson, the second thing that I learned this year, that by using creativity, particularly by creating things that are good, we can bring God glory. So at the start of the year, I read a book titled Images and Idols, Creativity for the Christian Life. The book laid out step by step how God is woven into every part of creativity, how sin taints creativity, and what Jesus' sacrifice means in light of what we make. This opened my eyes to a new perspective on creativity, one with God at the center. And practically, that would look like doing creative work as unto the Lord, to bring him glory. So what is creative work or creativity? Well, it can range from art to music, from a presentation like this one to coding. And that's not an exhaustive list. Because of the variety of different ways that people can be creative, I chose to define creativity as anything we do where we make something from raw materials, even to the level of envisioning a future that has not happened yet. When we think about creativity like that, we realize that it ultimately doesn't have to do with whether or not we can build something incredible with our hands or play a musical instrument. Every person is creative in some way. Creativity isn't something that just a few of us have and the rest don't possess. It's built into us. Talent helps express creativity, but it doesn't define it. A takeaway that I had from the book was, quote, "Creativity was not built for your kingdom. It was built for God's," end quote. When you realize creativity has a higher purpose, it's easier to see it as a gift, and a gift that wasn't made so we can build ourselves up, but rather so we can glorify God. As I said earlier, I had several interviews this year, two of which being Mr. Vaughn and Boylai. I asked both how they've seen God through creativity, or aspects of God's character that they've seen through creativity. Their answers were different in scope, but they've both seen God through the process of creating things that were beautiful or inspirational. So Boylai started by talking about examples of creativity throughout the Bible. Then he said, quote, "There's this ability that God's given people to take things and have dominion over them and turn them into something beautiful. And ultimately, obviously, the stuff people create is relatively meaningless. But if someone glorifies God in the creation of the thing, it's not meaningless." End quote. God has given us, as people, the ability to create things that are beautiful. And what we do with that ability is up to us. We can choose to glorify God with it, or we can try and glorify ourselves and our abilities, which in the end is meaningless. Ecclesiastes talks a lot about things being meaningless. The word for meaningless in Hebrew is hevel, and it means breath or vapor, something that's there and then gone in a moment, that doesn't last. Ecclesiastes 1:2, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless, or hevel. And that's not to say that nothing in this world has meaning. It fades, it's gone, and it can't be where we find fulfillment because of the nature of that. Creativity without God is self-defeating. So jumping to the second to last verse of Ecclesiastes, it says, "Now all has been heard. This is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." A fear of God in the Bible is described as a reverence or a respect that leads to obedience of what he says. The fear of God is also the beginning of wisdom, according to Proverbs 9:10, and it points us to create things that are good, right, and true. To fear God, to put him first in our process, that is what gives creativity its meaning. Mr. Vaughn, the second guy that I interviewed, said he's seen God through creativity in two ways. The first is as he's writing a song. He said, "In a lot of these songs, I find that I run against walls, and then I just put it away and I start praying. God, what am I going to be able to do? I've got an awesome chorus here. I'm never going to be able to come up with the rest. What can I think about?" And then someone says this Bible passage, and I'm like, "Oh, that's awesome." End quote. I have definitely been here before, especially when I'm stuck on a project. I don't know what to do, so I'll pray and ask God for wisdom for how to continue on. Sometimes I have to wait a little while, like in the case of the longboard. But after a little bit, I usually have an idea on what to do next or how to finish. The second way that Mr. Vaughn said he's seen God through creativity is through the process of creating things themselves. He said, "I've seen God in my process when I'm creating music, when I'm making, because in the music, when we use our gifts and talents, we're actually expressing God, something that God is." End quote. So not only can we glorify God through creating things, but also by creating things, we're living out his image that's been placed in us since the beginning. So as I've said, creativity takes time, effort, and intentionality, is a way we reflect God. And the third thing that I learned this year is that while trying to make things, you face a lot of obstacles. Through the 3 interviews that I did and personal experience creating things, it can often feel hard to begin creating something. It can be challenging to find inspiration or even feel like you can make something. I struggled with this while I was making the longboard. I was looking at what I wanted to draw out on the bottom of the longboard, and I had no idea what I wanted to put there. So I set it aside and worked on other things. I eventually found a cool design that I took and then traced out on the bottom, but that was about a week later. And I wouldn't say I exactly found inspiration. I brainstormed. I did a lot of searching, side-by-side comparison of different options. And eventually I found one that I could do and wanted to put on the bottom of my longboard. In my interview with Mr. Vaughn, I asked him where he finds inspiration, because it can often be one of the hardest things about creativity. He said, "Writing a song is more of a choice, and I find that for me that's what happens. I just choose to write something. I feel like I want to write something." End quote. So he decides that he wants to write something, and then he looks for something to write about. And that could be the season, or a wedding that he went to, or even a sermon he heard at church. Thing is, inspiration doesn't always come to you. You have to go and look and see things and take that as inspiration. You can't just wait. In my other interview, Boyle said something that really stuck with me. He said, "While I was entertaining myself, or using those things, video games, movies, media, to entertain me, I did notice a lot of my creativity was drained. I wasn't that inspired to go create things when I was constantly just consuming other people's stuff." End quote. Now, this convicted me because I realized a lot of the time I've just checked out and consumed movies or media, and that can be good, consuming like movies or media, if it's done with intentionality. Something that I've been really inspired by before has been seeing things that other people have created that's very creative. I begin to wonder how I might have made it or done things differently. Like in the case of the longboard, I spent several hours looking at different longboards with sizing and graphics and how I wanted mine to look. Then I took a tape measure and a pencil and I drew out what I wanted mine to look like. It had details from a lot of other longboards, but in the end was unique. It took a few hours to find something that I was really inspired by. The point is, inspiration doesn't always come to you. You have to look rather than it just coming. All right, now I know not all of you are really into making things. I've said a few ways of being creative so far, like music or making a costume or a longboard, but there's so many other ways to be creative, so many other things you can do. For example, painting, drawing something that's real or fictional, sculpting, a dance routine, interior design, and I'm just scratching the surface here. On a basic level, we as humans are creators. And the fact that we're created in the image of God testifies to that. That we all can create, regardless of how talented or skilled we think we are. And creativity isn't just limited to physical things either. We create dreams, ideas, futures. Creativity is a skill we can all grow in by spending time in God's creation, by making and forming things. Since our creation, we've been given the gift of creativity. And what good is a gift if we don't use it? God gave us our creativity, and part of stewarding that gift is actually using it, specifically for the glory of God. My challenge to you is to steward the gift and ability you have to create, and not just be a consumer of culture. Thank you.
Boom. Let's go.